This is part 3 of Entity Framework tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss the code first approach of Entity Framework. Entity Framework supports all these three approaches: schema first, model first, and code first. In part 1, we discussed the schema first approach. Model first approach is discussed in part 2, and in this video, we'll discuss the code first approach. Code first approach allows us to create our custom classes first, and based on those custom classes, Entity Framework can automatically generate the database and create the required tables for us. Let's understand using the code first approach with an example. We'll be modifying the same example that we worked with in the previous session of this video series. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So notice that we already have this employee model.edmx file which we have generated using the model first approach in the previous session of this video series. So let's go ahead and delete that first because we no longer require that. And let's also delete this employee model.edmx.sql file which contains the required SQL to create the database tables. So let's go ahead and delete that as well. Alright, all we have at the moment is the web.config file and the web form which contains the grid view control and the entity data source control. So to this project, let's add a class file and let's call this department.cs. So this file is going to contain the definition for department class. So what are the things that a typical department contains? ID, name, location, and a department will also contain some employees. So it is also going to contain maybe employees property, which is going to return list of employees back. Okay, so basically our department class is going to look like this with ID, name, location, and employees property, which is going to return list of employee objects. Okay, to speed things up, I have already typed these properties, so let's copy them from this notepad and paste within department class. Okay, and if you notice at the moment, look at this employee, we have a compilation error. Why is that? That's because we don't have the employee class yet. So let's go ahead and create the employee class. So again, to this project, let's add another class file and let's call it employee.cs. And what are the properties that an employee should have? That is ID, first name, last name, gender, salary, and the department to which the employee belongs. So the employee class will look something like this. And to speed things up, again, I have all these properties typed. So let's copy them from the notepad and then paste within our employee class. Okay, now this department property within the employee class and employees property within the department class are navigation properties. The rest of them are scalar properties. Okay, so department.employees, we are trying to retrieve objects of another type. So basically list of employees, they belong to another table, so it's a navigation property in Entity Framework terms. Similarly, in employee object, department is a navigation property. Okay, so we have the custom classes that are required for our application, because basically within our web form we want to display the department ID, name, location, and the list of employees who belong to that specific department. Okay, so basically to achieve this functionality, we are first creating our custom classes with the required properties, and based on these classes we are now going to generate the underlying database tables. Let's see how to achieve that with the help of Entity Framework. So the next step here is to add another class file. So far what we have done, we have just created our custom classes, the department and employee classes. So step 3 is to add another class file, and let's call this employee DB context. You can give this file any name you want, but the reason why I have chosen this name, there's a specific reason for that. We'll discuss that in just a bit. So we are going to make this class employee DB context inherit from another class called DB context, and this class is present in system.data.entity namespace, which is present within this Entity Framework assembly. So let's go ahead and bring in system.data.entity namespace, And then let's make this class employee DB context inherit from DB context class. So this is the class, this base class DB context is what is doing all the work to interact with the database, retrieve data for us, and then populate our custom objects. Okay, so we are going to inherit from that class, and within this employee DB context class I'm going to have two properties. Okay, and both of them are going to be public. And what are these properties going to return? These properties are going to return a DB set of department objects. Okay, and I'm going to call the property departments, and then let's have a get and a set accessor. Similarly, let's have another public property, and this one is going to return DB set of employee objects, and let's call the property employees. So very simple class, employee DB context, with just two public properties. Okay, now there is another thing that we need to do. Basically, let's add another class file. And again, we can give this class file any meaningful name we want, but I'm going to call it employee repository. So basically this class is going to contain our methods which are going to return the data that we want. Okay, so here what we want, you can write methods to return list of employees, list of departments, or one employee, one department. We'll write all our custom logic within this employee repository file. Okay, you can do that within the code behind file as well, but since I want to use object data source control, I'm going to use a separate class file, and then I'm going to include all the methods which is going to retrieve data within this class. So let's call this public. This is going to return list of department objects back. So I'm going to return list of departments, and let's call this get departments. So this method is basically going to return all the departments that are going to be there in the departments table within the database. Okay, and to retrieve the departments, remember this employee DB context class is what is going to interact with the database behind the scenes using this DB context class. Okay, so we are going to create an instance of this employee DB context class within our employee repository. So employee DB context, let's call this employee DB context equals employee DB context dot, look at that, we have departments property, we have employees property. Departments property, what is it returning back? DB set of department objects, but this method is returning list of department objects, so we need to convert that to a list, and to do that simply use toList method, and we want to return that back to whoever is calling this method. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward method. Okay, now another important thing that we need to do is look at our DB context class. It's called employee DB context. Now the convention is Entity Frameworks looks for a connection string in the web.config file with that name to retrieve or to save data back to the database. Basically, to connect to the database, Entity Framework is going to look for a connection string with the same name in web.config file. So let's go to web.config file, and if you look at this connection string section, we already have a connection string there that was basically generated for us by the model first approach. We no longer need that, so let's get rid of that connection string from there. Okay, and let's add a connection string. Let's give it a name, and keep in mind the name should match with this class name. You can change it, but there is some work that needs to be done. We'll discuss that maybe in a later video session. For now, let's use the defaults. And then we specify the connection string, so server is equal to dot. In my case, the server is installed on the same machine, and the database is going to be sample, and I'm going to use Windows authentication, so integrated security is equal to true. Alright, so we have the name of the connection string and connection string itself. Now we have all that is required. So let's flip to our webform1.aspx. Now at the moment, look at this, we are using entity data source control, but we have a custom object here, employee repository, which is giving us the objects that we want to display. So I'm going to make use of object data source control instead of entity data source control. So I'm going to delete this entity data source control from there, and then from the toolbox let's drag and drop an object data source control, and let's configure this data source control. Now when we drop this, look at that, we don't find our employee repository class. That's basically because we have not built our project. So let's go ahead and build the solution once. And now if we go to configure data source, so choose your business object which contains the data. So employee repository is the one which is going to give us the data that we want. And then once we click next on the object data source, look at this, we can specify the methods to retrieve data, to update, insert, and delete. In this case, we are only going to retrieve data. So what is the select method going to be? Get departments. And where is this present? Within our employee repository class, which is going to return a list of departments. Select that and click finish. Now we need to associate this object data source with this grid view control. So choose data source. At the moment it is having that entity data source 1 which we used in the previous session, but we want to use object data source 1 control which we just added. The moment I do that, it's asking me, do you want to refresh fields and keys for grid view 1? For now I'm going to say no, because it's essentially going to be the same properties, ID, name, location, and employees is going to contain this a template field which contains another grid view control which is going to basically display employee details. We discussed that in our previous session, so I'm not going to go into the details of that here. Alright, so with these changes, let's go ahead and build our solution, and then let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. If you remember from the previous video session, we have already created the sample database, but with code first approach, the database need not exist at all. So I'm going to delete this database from here. So make sure you check this box, close existing connections, and then click OK. So if there are any open connections, it's going to close them and then delete the database. So we don't have the sample database at the moment. And then now when we come here and then run this project, it should actually create the database for us and then create the departments and employee tables if everything is done correctly. But look at this, we have a problem. It says the connection string employee DB context in the app config file does not contain the required provider name attribute. So for the connection string within web.config file, there is something missing, and that is provider name. At the moment we have specified name and connection string. We also need to specify provider name. Now here we are using SQL Server, so the provider is going to be system.data.sql client. So that's what we have to specify as the provider name here, system.data.sql client. Alright, with that change, let's go ahead and run this form once again. So now it should create the sample database, it should create the departments table and employee table, and it should also establish any primary key relationship between the tables. Now notice that we don't have any data here. That's basically because the application has just created the database and the required tables. So let's come here and refresh the databases, and notice that sample database is there. And if we expand tables, look at that, we have got departments table and employees table. If we expand departments, and then if you look at the columns, notice that we have got ID, name, location, which corresponds to the properties that we have, ID, name, location. Okay, and then if we expand the employees table, and look at the columns, we have got ID, first name, last name, gender, salary, and we also have department ID, the foreign key. Okay, so every employee has a department associated with them, so there is this department ID foreign key. And to find out how many employees belong to a specific department, we basically can use the department ID and then tell how many employees belong to a specific department. Okay, so it has created these tables for us, but then if you look at the data, they are basically going to be empty. Why? Because it just created the tables. In our next video, we'll see how to use Entity Framework to populate these tables with sample data. But for now, let's manually insert some data into these two tables. So let's go ahead and execute these insert queries. Now if we execute the select query, we should get the data back. Alright, now let's go ahead and refresh this web form. Okay, now look at this. We get to see ID, name, and location of the department. But why is employees blank? That's basically because, remember, within department class, we have this employee's navigation property, which is going to return list of employee objects. By default, the data for the navigation property is not loaded. If you want the data of navigation properties to be loaded, then we'll have to tell that to the entity framework. And the way we do that is within our employee repository. Notice that we're using this db context object to retrieve departments. Now this departments property also has this method called include, where you can specify the navigation property name for which you want the data to be included. In our case, we want employees data to be included with every department. So we specify that as a string for this include method, and that's it, we're done. So let's go ahead and run our web application once more, and this time we should see employees data as well. Okay, there we go. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.